I love camping. Anytime my friends and I came home from college, we would load up our cooler with beer, grab some gear, and go screw around outside. Unfortunately, when I was actually at school, none of my sorority sisters or other friends ever wanted to go with me, so I would often suffer withdrawals from camping. One day the weather was way too nice to waste, so I grabbed some of my gear, hopped in a car I borrowed from a buddy, and drove to a spot that was secluded yet within a safe distance to civilization that I could run and get help. Camping also creeps me out sometimes, but that creepy feeling is also somewhat of a plus for me. It's the same reason that people like horror stories. It's fun to be scared. So I make a little camp and get a fire going. I hadn't brought all that much to eat, but I was enjoying myself, reading and looking around the area, that sort of thing. I got the feeling I was being watched, and I stopped dead in my tracks. I hear a twig crunch over to my right, then see a doe bolt from 100 feet or so in front of me. I laughed at myself and went back to the camp with the armful of wood I had gathered. I kept freaking myself out, hearing sounds just outside of the ring of light cast by the fire. I always get inside my head, so I shrugged it off and kept whittling at a stick I had been messing with. Around 1, I decide to go into my tent and snuff out the lantern. I had been slamming beers in the most unladylike fashion and smoking cheap cigars, so I passed out relatively quick. About 2, I start hearing footsteps. They sound pretty light and sort of timid. I think to myself that it's a deer or other animal, more likely a raccoon because I had probably left some food out. I'm still on guard though. About 30 minutes of sleeping with one eye open, I hear a rubbing noise, and the tent fabric is being pushed in a bit. I don't know how I didn't soil my sleeping bag, but I just sat there paralyzed with my K-bar in my hand. I desperately wanted to thrust the knife through the tent fabric, but I was still holding out hope that it was some of my buddies from a frat joking with me. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it all stopped. I was starting to feel slightly more secure, because daylight would be coming in about 2 or 3 hours, but I sure as hell wasn't going to go to sleep. All of a sudden, at about 4 o'clock, I realized I should put my boots on so that if anything did happen, I would be ready. After having stayed up and keeping alert a little while longer, my friend's car alarm goes blaring. I freak out and run out of the tent. I got about 2 steps before something grabs me around the mouth. I opened my mouth to scream, but instead, the person's pinky finger slips between my teeth. I've heard that people can perform superhuman feats when they have huge adrenaline rushes. In my case, I just clamped down, and, there's no way to say this without sounding ridiculous, his finger popped off. He screamed and pulled his hand away with the missing digit falling to the ground. He took off running down the hill I was camping on. I took off right quick in the opposite direction. I must have looked ridiculous to the people whose house I ran to, a little sorority girl in a wife-beater, boxers, and steel-toe boots. I also had some blood that had oozed out of my lip, not from the finger, but because I had also managed to take a pretty good chunk out of my lip as well. I told them what happened. They called the police, got me some real clothing, and the man at the house made me a whiskey and coke. The cops went to check it out, and when they came back, it was light out. They brought me back so I could get my friend's car, and what I saw just made me more scared. Right next to the tent was a red gas can. He could have just lit me on fire earlier. The finger was also gone, suggesting he had come back. The kicker is they never caught the guy, so somewhere out there is a man sitting down to dinner, maybe alone, maybe with a wife and a couple of kids, and he's missing his right pinky. My dad is a journalist and nonfiction writer, but at the time was a reporter for the Virginian Pilot based out of Virginia. He was working on a new book titled The Big Roads when this occurred. We often went on road trips for his research needs, and once his proposal for this new book was accepted, we went on a cross-country road trip from Virginia to California and back on Old Route 66 for the book. Me being 13 at the time, I demanded he let me bring a friend along, and so we were 3. The first quarter of our month-long adventure went off without a hitch. We either stayed in motels with the occasional stay at a grand old historic hotel. My dad, being the outdoors man that he is, decided that we should camp about 5 or 6 times throughout the trip. The first night we camped, we were in the middle of literal nowhere. No one for at least 20 miles on either side in the middle of the Utah desert. When we arrived at our campsite in our rented minivan, my dad wanted to explore a bit, because at the bottom of the hill that our campsite was situated on was an old Pony Express stop. My friend decided to stay in the minivan until my dad and I had finished checking out the Pony Express stop to set up camp on account of all the wasps and bees. We were utterly alone, and as a rather jumpy and skittish 13-year-old girl, it became apparent we were isolated to the point that if anything happened, we would be screwed. That's all I could think about as my dad and I walked down the hill to explore. We checked out the old station, and everything was going smoothly until we were about halfway back up the hill. A large truck that we noticed driving down the old dirt road a few minutes before had turned into the campsite. We were surprised, but really didn't think anything of it. Maybe this guy was on an adventure too. The truck parked halfway up the road, and a man got out. He had what I think was a hunting rifle, and started hunting around the area my dad and I were in, about 50 feet from our campsite. Of course, this was an absolute no-hunting zone, and my dad became a bit concerned because my friend was closer to the stranger than she was to us. He yelled out to the man, saying that there were children around, and he couldn't hunt there. As soon as the man turned to face us, I got an overwhelming sense of complete doom. I felt in my entire body that something was not right. The man looked us over, and without saying a word, aimed his gun at us. My dad does not carry a gun or knife or any kind of weapon. I felt trapped. My dad ushered me behind a large boulder, but he didn't hide. He stood his ground. There was a solid minute of this man aiming his gun at my dad, and my dad standing completely still, staring back. In my mind, I considered all of the ways this could go down. I was absolutely terrified this guy would shoot my dad, and somehow my friend and I would have to escape or get murdered during this tense minute. The guy lowered his gun, cocked his head to the side, and pointed at my dad using the fake gun fingers and fake shot him. He got in his truck and drove away. That night, my friend and I slept in the minivan in 90-degree heat because I was positive this guy would come back and murder us all. Fortunately, he didn't come back. A few other creepy incidents occurred on that trip, but we were fine and safe after all. My girlfriend at the time and I were on a backpacking trip through northern Vermont, 10 days of hiking and camping in the great outdoors. We were carrying everything we needed for the entire trip, food, supplies, etc., and weren't planning on leaving the trail at all. I've been doing outdoor stuff my entire life and feel very comfortable on trips like this. My girlfriend had done a decent amount of hiking and camping, but had never been on a trip this long. Honestly, I was totally psyched to have a girlfriend interested in this sort of thing. My previous girlfriends had been good for a day hike, but that's about it. Anyway, the woods and, more importantly, weather were beautiful, and everything on our trip was going great. Our routine was pretty simple. We'd hike around 15 miles during the day, and then when it started to get a bit dark, we'd hike off the trail into the woods a few hundred yards or so and find a nice flat place to set up our tent for the night. It's always surprising to me how alone you can be out in the woods. The first few days we saw maybe 3 or 4 other hikers each day, usually just walking by us in the opposite direction. By the 4th day, we had stopped seeing other hikers at all. This is because we had hiked farther north by this point into a more secluded area that gets a lot less foot traffic. So, it's the 7th night, and we haven't seen anyone else for probably 3 or 4 days at this point. I fell asleep and woke up very early, as I always do while camping. Typically, I had been lying in my sleeping bag, waiting for my girlfriend to wake up. But while I was lying there, I heard a noise outside of our tent of something walking around. We were pretty close to the edge of a river, and I was excited, thinking that I might get to see a moose. I got out of the tent as quietly as I could. It was still dark out, the sun was not up yet, but my eyes were used to the low light. I scanned around for a moose or another animal, but didn't see anything. Eventually, I made something out, though, because of movement. There was a man standing about 100 feet from where our tent was, and as I watched, he turned off and walked into the woods. You know that feeling you get on a roller coaster when everything drops out from under you? I had that exact same feeling out in the woods and had no idea what to do. A lot of possibilities were racing through my head. Was he a hunter or random camper who just stumbled on our tent? If so, why was he out so early in the morning? The sun isn't even up yet. I checked my watch. It was 4 a.m. If he wasn't a hunter, then were unintentionally we on his property. Was he pissed? Why didn't he say anything? I was having trouble coming up with explanations that made sense and weren't just completely terrifying. I ended up getting my girlfriend up a lot earlier than normal, and we hiked lots of extra miles that day. I had no idea if this guy was following us or what. I spent all day looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him every single time coming up from behind. Of course, nothing happened, and we finished out the trip safely. The vision of this guy walking off into the shadowy woods is still completely etched into my mind years later.